Hello, family, and happy Thursday. Let's just start with the truth, because clearly the headline didn't. A so-called explosive article claims a royal photographer is finally lifting the lid on Meghan Sussex and Prince Harry and their behind-the-scenes behavior. Sounds serious, right? Sounds like we're about to hear something shocking. Except no, because the actual person they're quoting, Chris Jackson, didn't expose anything negative, not even a little bit. He didn't hint at drama, he didn't suggest tension, he didn't reveal any bad behavior. He said, and I'm paraphrasing the entire so-called story here, "They were great. I enjoyed working with them." That's it. That's the lid. So what we're really looking at here isn't journalism, it's clickbait doing backflips trying to turn praise into suspicion. Because somehow, according to page 6, a man having a consistently positive experience with Harry and Meghan is something that needs to be framed like a warning sign. Make it make sense. Let's be very clear. When someone who has actually worked with them repeatedly on tours, major events, even something as impactful as the Invictus Games, comes out and says, they were fantastic, they have a great dynamic, it was an incredible experience, that's not ambiguous. That's not reading between the lines. That's direct, clear, positive testimony. And the fact that it still gets packaged like some kind of ominous reveal tells you everything about how desperate certain media outlets are to keep a negative narrative alive. Because here's the uncomfortable reality they keep trying to dodge. The people who actually interact with Meghan Sussex and Prince Harry keep saying good things about them. Consistently, repeatedly, across years, across different roles, across different situations, and every single time the media has to do this weird little dance where they pretend praise is somehow suspicious. So no, nothing was lifted, no scandal was uncovered, no secret behavior was exposed. What actually happened is much simpler, and apparently much harder for some outlets to accept. Reality didn't match the narrative. Just a man, a photographer, a professional who has spent years working within royal circles, someone with real credibility and zero motivation to spin a positive story for people he has no particular loyalty to, sitting there, calmly, clearly, and without hesitation saying, "They were great. I enjoyed working with them." That's the lid. That's what got lifted. That's the behind-the-scenes bombshell we were promised. Two people being pleasant, professional, and genuinely good to work with. I want you to really sit with the absurdity of that for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. We have arrived at a place in media, specifically in the media ecosystem that has built itself around Meghan and Harry, where someone saying, "I had a great experience working with them," gets packaged as a dramatic exposé, where a compliment gets dressed in the clothes of a scandal, where sunshine gets sold as a storm. And the most remarkable part? This isn't a one-off. This isn't a slow newsday mishap. This isn't a single editor making a poor judgment call on a Tuesday afternoon. This is a pattern, a consistent, deliberate, endlessly creative pattern that requires real effort to maintain. Think about what it actually takes to do this every single day. You have to wake up, review the available material, find the most positive story imaginable, and then ask yourself with genuine commitment, how do I make this sound like something worth being suspicious about? That takes energy. That takes a specific and deeply specialized skill set. That takes a level of dedicated creativity that, honestly, if redirected toward literally anything else, could probably solve several of the world's more pressing problems. But here we are. So let's actually look at what the photographer said, because the quotes deserve their own moment in the spotlight, not because they're shocking, but because they're so thoroughly, aggressively, almost defiantly normal that placing them next to that headline creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that is genuinely difficult to process. He said he's always had a great experience photographing them both. Always. Not once, not on a good day, not when the conditions were right and everyone was cooperating. Always. That's a word that covers time and consistency. That's a professional reflecting on a body of work and arriving at a clear, unhedged conclusion. And that conclusion is great experience. Every time. He said the jobs were fantastic. Not fine, not manageable, not professional enough, I suppose. Fantastic. A superlative, the kind of word you use when something genuinely exceeded expectations or delivered something worth celebrating. He talked about their dynamic as a couple, described it as great. Two people who clearly like each other, support each other, function well together both privately and publicly, which is, in the context of everything that has been written about their relationship, a fairly significant thing for someone who has observed them up close to confirm without prompting. And then the Invictus Games. He called it an incredible achievement. And here I need to pause, because the Invictus Games are not a background detail you can slide past without acknowledgement. This is a globally respected, genuinely impactful sporting event created specifically to support wounded, injured, and sick armed forces personnel and veterans. It gives people who have sacrificed enormously a platform for competition, recovery, and community. It has grown from a single event into an international institution. When someone who has worked within that environment, who has seen it operate up close, calls it an incredible achievement, that's not a polite platitude. That's an informed assessment from someone in a position to make one. So you have, in a single article, consistent praise from a credible professional source, confirmation of a genuinely warm working relationship, validation of a major humanitarian initiative, and zero, absolutely zero negative information of any kind. And the headline the media chose for this collection of facts was, "Royal Photographer Lifts Lid on Behind-the-Scenes Behavior." Now, if this article had been written about literally any other public figure, any other couple, any other members of any other royal family anywhere in the world, the headline would have been so boringly accurate it would have barely registered. Something like, "Photographer praises working relationship with royal couple." Clean, honest, proportionate. The kind of headline that matches its content so precisely that nobody feels manipulated after reading it. But that headline doesn't work for Meghan and Harry. Not in this media ecosystem. Not when the machine has been running long enough that certain editorial habits have calcified into something that looks, from the outside, less like journalism and more like institutional reflex. The reflex is, whatever the story is, whatever the facts say, whatever the source actually communicated, it needs to sound more than it is. It needs to carry the weight of suspicion. It needs to arrive wrapped in the suggestion that something is being revealed, something is being uncovered, something was hidden and has now been brought to light. Even when the something is, they're great. And here's the part that really pulls back the curtain on how this whole operation functions. Because it's not just about the headline. The headline is actually the most honest part of the deception, which is a sentence I never expected to write, but here we are. The headline is where the intent is most visible, but the real machinery is subtler than that, and it operates on a very specific understanding of human behavior. Most people don't read articles. This is not a criticism. It's a documented reality of how people engage with online media. You see a headline, you react, you form an impression, you move on. And that impression, formed in 2 seconds from 14 words chosen specifically to manufacture it, is what stays with you. That's what gets filed in the mental folder labeled with that person's name. That's what accumulates, story after story, headline after headline, into something that feels like knowledge, but is actually just repeated exposure to carefully crafted suggestion. The article is almost irrelevant. It exists for legal cover. It exists so that when someone says, that headline is misleading, the response can be, well, we printed the quotes. We printed what he said. The full story is right there. And technically, yes, the full story is right there. The quotes are accurate. The photographer's words are faithfully reproduced. But the architecture around those words, The headline, the framing, the implication baked into the presentation tells a completely different story, one that the actual content doesn't support, one that the photographer, presumably, never intended to tell, one that serves the narrative rather than the truth. They didn't lie. They just dressed reality in a costume and hoped you wouldn't look close enough to notice the zipper. And what makes this specific instance particularly worth examining is the nature of the source. This isn't an anonymous insider. It's not someone with a grievance, a book to sell, or a complicated history with the couple. It's not a former staff member nursing a professional wound, or a friend of a friend whose connection to the story is conveniently impossible to verify. This is a working photographer with professional standing and no discernible agenda, whose access to the couple came through legitimate channels, whose observations are grounded in direct experience, and whose assessment is therefore about as close to objective external testimony as this conversation ever gets. And that testimony is, they were fantastic. You cannot spin that. Not really. You can try, and clearly someone did, but the spin requires you to pretend the content of the article doesn't say what it says. It requires you to rely on the fact that most people won't read past the headline. It requires you to bet on inattention, on confirmation bias, on the accumulated weight of years of negative framing doing enough work that the word behavior in a headline is enough to keep the suspicion alive even when the article itself dismantles it completely. It's a bet that, historically, has paid off. Because this is what years of sustained negative coverage actually produces. Not just headlines and articles, not just individual stories. It produces a lens through which a subject is perpetually viewed, a lens so thoroughly installed in the audience's perception that even clearly positive information gets filtered through it and emerges looking vaguely suspicious. They said something nice about her, but why? What are they not saying? What's the real story? The real story is that there is no real story. The real story is that people who actually work with Meghan and Harry tend to describe those experiences positively. Not uniformly, not without nuance, but positively. This isn't an isolated data point. It's part of a pattern that keeps emerging from different sources, in different contexts, over different periods of time. Staff who have spoken publicly about their experiences, collaborators who have reflected on joint projects, professionals from the charity and advocacy sectors who have worked alongside them on initiatives, people who had no particular reason to be favorable and every professional incentive to be accurate. And the picture that emerges from those accounts is of two people who are engaged, genuine, hardworking, and, by the assessment of a royal photographer who has spent years in their professional orbit, great. That's not PR. You can't manufacture that kind of consistent external testimony across multiple independent sources over multiple years. You can manage a press release, you can craft a statement, you can control a narrative for a while, in certain conditions, but you cannot fake the accumulated impressions of dozens of independent professionals who have no coordination with each other and no shared motivation to tell the same story. The story keeps being the same story because the story is true. But truth, in this particular media ecosystem, has a complicated relationship with the business model. And the business model is worth understanding because it explains so much of what we're actually observing. Negativity generates engagement. This is not a theory or a media criticism talking point. It is an empirically documented feature of how human attention works and how digital platforms have been designed to exploit it. We respond more strongly, more immediately, and more viscerally to negative information than to positive information. We share it more readily. We comment on it more passionately. We return to it more frequently. The algorithms know this, the editors know this, the headline writers know this. And Meghan, specifically, has become one of the most reliably engagement-generating subjects in the entire British media landscape. Her name in a headline moves numbers, it drives clicks, it fills comment sections, it generates the kind of sustained, passionate, recurring audience engagement that is the foundational currency of the attention economy. Which means that even when the story is genuinely positive, even when the honest headline would be, "Photographer says working with Meghan and Harry was fantastic," there is a powerful structural incentive to find a way to reframe it, because the positive version doesn't perform. It doesn't generate the emotional activation that keeps people clicking, sharing, arguing, and returning. So you get lifts lid on behind-the-scenes behavior instead. And this is where it stops being merely ironic and starts being genuinely revealing, because what this headline, and the dozens like it that have preceded it, actually demonstrates is not that Meghan and Harry are controversial. It demonstrates that the machine assigned to covering them is determined to present them as controversial regardless of what the evidence shows. It demonstrates that the narrative has a life independent of the facts, that it self-perpetuates, that it has become so embedded in certain editorial cultures that even an objectively positive story cannot be allowed to land as what it actually is. Think about what that means for the people living inside that narrative. Think about what it actually feels like to have every professional interaction you have, every project you complete, every relationship you build, filtered through a system that is structurally committed to making it look bad. Or the best possible outcome of someone saying something genuinely positive about you is that the story gets dressed up to look like it might not be positive. Or even the wins come wrapped in the visual language of scandal. You cannot win in that system. Not through behavior, not through excellence, not through consistency, not through the kind of sustained, cross-confirmed, independently verified positive testimony that this photographer just added to an already substantial pile. Because the system isn't designed to be won, it's designed to keep running. And yet, and this is the part that matters, the part that makes these small moments of escaped truth worth paying attention to, reality keeps showing up anyway. It shows up in interviews from people who have actually been in the room. It shows up in the testimony of professionals who have nothing to gain from flattery and everything to lose from inaccuracy. It shows up in the consistent, cross-contextual, independently produced picture of two people who are, by virtually every first-hand account, exactly what they present themselves as being: genuine, warm, hardworking, committed, and occasionally, in articles designed to suggest otherwise, someone just says it plainly enough that even the headline can't fully obscure it. They were fantastic. The jobs were fantastic. Great dynamic. Incredible achievement. That's not a scandal. That's not a lid being lifted on hidden darkness. That's sunshine breaking through a very determined cloud cover. That's reality doing what reality does, persisting, regardless of the narrative being constructed around it. So the next time you see a headline about Meghan and Harry that promises drama, revelation, exposure, do the thing that this entire media system is betting you won't do. Click it. Read it. All the way to the end. Read the actual quotes. Read what the actual human being with actual first-hand experience actually said. Separate the content from the framing. Hold the headline next to the story and ask yourself honestly whether one matches the other. Because more often than not, far more often than the clicks and the comment sections and the years of accumulated outrage would suggest, the truth is sitting right there in the article. Calm, consistent, completely at odds with everything the presentation is trying to imply. And that gap, that yawning, unmistakable, increasingly hard to ignore gap between what the media presents and what the evidence actually shows, tells you something important. Not about Meghan, not about Harry, about the machine covering them, about what it needs to survive, about what it's afraid of. And the thing it's most afraid of is exactly what keeps happening. Reality showing up, uninvited, wearing a photographer's press credentials and saying, actually, they were great.